In today's video, we're talking intermittent fasting. What's up YouTube? Welcome to the video. My name is Tyler, also known as the Fit Chemist, and I help people take control of their lives by taking control of their fitness and nutrition habits so that ultimately we can lead healthier and happier lives. So if you are new here, welcome. Please consider subscribing. Turn those notification bells on so you don't miss when I post new videos. And if you are returning, welcome back. I'm so glad that you are here. In my last video, I talked all about intermittent fasting, what it is, what attracts people to it, and what does the science say when it comes to fat loss. So if you haven't already seen that, go ahead and check that out now. I'll put a little time card somewhere up here, and then I'll also put the thumbnail over here, so that way if you go looking for it after, you know what that thumbnail looks like. But as you know, on this channel, we are not only interested in just losing fat, we are also interested in building muscle, so that when we lose that fat, we look and feel our best. At the end of that last video, I mentioned 2 studies that suggested that while you are intermittent fasting, you can maintain some muscle mass. So I thought in today's video, we would dive into those studies a little deeper. We're gonna look at 2 additional studies as well as 2 meta-analysis and see what the science says with intermittent fasting and how it relates to building or maintaining muscle. So with that, let's get into it. The first study that I mentioned in the previous video is one done by Tinsley and coworkers in 2016, and they were interested in looking at the effects of intermittent fasting versus a traditional diet or non-intermittent fasting in 18 untrained men. The intermittent fasting group had a 4-hour eating window, so they had 20 hours of fasting per day, and then a 4-hour eating window in which they were advised to eat whatever and however much food they wanted. So I do think that is a major drawback of this study because, again, they didn't necessarily limit how much they ate and they didn't tell them what to eat either, which means the macros could have been all across the board for this study from participant to participant. Nonetheless, the participants in this study were following a 3-day lifting program in which they alternated between upper and lower body workouts, and when they were doing so, they were following an 8 to 12 rep range and they were training to muscular failure. The researchers did analysis at weeks 0, so time 0 or the starting point of the study, week 4, which is the halfway point, and then week 8, which is the final point of the study. And what they were looking at was body composition by DEXA, so fat-free mass or lean body mass, fat mass, body fat percentage. They're also looking at muscle cross-sectional area in your biceps and your quads, and they also tested strength by doing a 1-rep max test on the bench press and leg press. The authors of this study found that even though the intermittent fasting group was advised to eat however much they wanted and whatever they wanted, they actually reduced their calories by 650 calories per day. They found no significant changes in body composition as well as an increase in muscle cross-sectional area in both groups. However, they did note that the non-time restricted feeding group or the control group, so the group that is not doing intermittent fasting, they actually gained 2.3 kilograms of muscle, whereas the intermittent fasting group lost 0.2 kilograms of muscle. They attribute this to the fact that the non-time restricted feeding group, or the group that's not doing intermittent fasting, was able to consume more protein throughout the day. So at the end of this study, they found that that particular group was eating 1.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, whereas the intermittent fasting group was only eating 1.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is a pretty significant difference. If you're eating more protein, obviously you're going to be getting more muscle. This makes sense though, right? We know that protein is a satiating macronutrient, and if you only have a 4-hour eating window, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to eat a large amount of protein in that short time span. Both groups in the study did improve their bench press and their leg press 1-rep maxes, although they do note that the non-intermittent fasting group did have bigger increases in these lifts. So I think the takeaway from this study is that intermittent fasting might be okay in terms of holding on to your gains, but there's no evidence in this study to suggest that intermittent fasting is better for muscle gain. In fact, we actually saw the opposite. The next study we're going to look at was done by Tinsley, so the same author as the previous study, except this time he's actually looking at intermittent fasting in females, so it had a very similar study design. In this one, they took 64 women and they split them up into 3 groups. So this time they had a time-restricted or intermittent fasting group that was taking 3-hydroxymethylbutyrate. They had a group that was not taking that supplement, and then they also had a control group. So we're not going to get into the science of that particular supplement supplement, we're just going to look at the facts concerning the intermittent fasting group and the non-intermittent fasting group. The female participants in this study underwent a resistance training program for 8 weeks, so the same duration as the previous study, except this time they actually controlled calories and protein, which I think was a drawback of that previous study. Unlike that previous study, however, these results, they found that fat-free mass, muscle hypertrophy, and strength increased across all 3 groups. At the same time, they found that both of the intermittent fasting groups actually lost fat mass, whereas the control diet or non-intermittent fasting did not lose any fat mass. So what's the takeaway of this study? Well, it seems to suggest that in terms of a body composition goal, that intermittent fasting might be superior because again, it reduced fat mass while increasing muscle mass and strength. However, what I do want to point out is that it's not superior for muscle mass and hypertrophy because all of the groups, including the group that was not doing intermittent fasting, saw increases in hypertrophy and strength. We'll dive back into the science of intermittent fasting in just 1 second, but I do want to say if you're getting some value out of this video, go ahead, smash that like button for me. Let me know in the comments down below. Today's question of the day is, have you tried intermittent fasting? And if so, what was your experience with it? Let me know in the comments down below. And with that, let's hop back into it. The next study we're going to look at was done by Moro and co-workers, and they were looking at 34 resistance trained men. So all the participants in this study actually had over 5 years of resistance training experience, which is a pretty big deal because the first study we looked at was in untrained men. The study duration was for 8 weeks, and what they did was they split all the participants into 2 groups. So they had an intermittent fasting group following the 16 and 8 method, so an 8-hour eating window in which they ate at 1 p.m., 4 p.m., and then I think 8 p.m. as well. And then they had a non-intermittent fasting group that ate at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and then 8 p.m. So they were eating throughout the day. Both of the groups ate at 100% of their energy demands, so basically eating at maintenance calories, and they do say in this study that they did equate macros across both groups, so protein intake was the same. All participants followed a 3-day workout program. They had 2 upper body days and 1 lower body day per week, in which they were training between 80 to 90% of their 1 rep max, and they were training to failure in this study as well. This study, like the other 2 that we talked about, used pretty similar methods for analysis. So they looked at the body composition using DEXA scans, so that gives you fat-free mass or lean body mass as well as fat mass, and from that you can calculate body fat percentage. They also looked at strength increases in the bench press and leg press, as well as some blood markers and different hormones in the blood. After the 8 weeks, they saw that the intermittent fasting group lost fat mass, whereas the control group or non-intermittent fasting group did not lose fat mass. However, both groups did maintain their fat-free body mass, so muscle and lean body mass. They also maintained their strength on the bench press and the leg press, as well as their muscle cross-sectional areas. However, one important point of this study that I mentioned is that they did look at various blood markers, so they found that testosterone and IGF-1 or insulin growth factor 1 both decreased in the intermittent fasting group, and both of those are hormones which are very important when it comes to muscle growth. So the takeaway for this study is that intermittent fasting might be better in terms of maintaining fat-free mass while losing fat. However, it suggests that intermittent fasting is not actually superior for muscle gain because of the decrease in testosterone. The next study we're going to look at was done by Stratton et al., and this was actually only a 4-week period in which they took 26 men, and again they split them up into 2 groups, intermittent fasting versus non-intermittent fasting. Both groups were eating in a 25% calorie deficit in which calories and protein were equated, and then the time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting group had an 8-hour eating window, so 12 p.m. to 8 p.m., whereas the control group or non-intermittent fasting group just ate their normal daily eating habits. In this study, they also trained for 3 days per week, and you can probably guess what markers they were looking at because all of these studies are quite similar. Again, they were looking at body composition with DEXA. They're also looking at muscle cross-sectional area, blood biomarkers, and then increases in strength and performance in terms of the bench press and leg press. Both groups saw significant decreases in total body mass, fat mass, and thus body fat percentage, as well as testosterone and resting energy expenditure, while also seeing increases in strength on the bench press, vertical jump, leg press, and then I think they also saw increases in muscle cross-sectional area on their biceps and quads. Fat-free mass between both groups was also maintained, so this suggested to the authors that just by going in a calorie deficit, intermittent fasting does not necessarily grant any sort of advantage in terms of fat mass reduction. The takeaway from this study, again, is that intermittent fasting is not necessarily superior for fat loss, but the evidence does seem to suggest in this study that you can build some muscle and gain some strength while still in a calorie deficit, regardless if you are doing intermittent fasting or not. And I do think that's probably because they took relatively untrained men. So in this study, they're doing what was called recreationally active people, so lifting like 2 to 4 times per week for the last 6 months, which I don't think is super serious, so it's likely that these people were just seeing some of their newbie gains. Now we're going to look at 2 meta-analyses to sort of put the icing on the cake. The first one was a meta-analysis done by Keenan and coworkers, in which they were looking at the effects of intermittent fasting versus non-intermittent fasting on lean body mass in both trained and untrained individuals. So in this particular meta-analysis, they weren't necessarily as concerned with loss of fat mass, but more so what happened to lean body mass while doing intermittent fasting. The authors from this study looked through 4 different databases, so PubMed and 3 others, and they found 8 articles about intermittent fasting that met their criteria. After summing up all of the results, they found that generally speaking, intermittent fasting might be good for maintaining lean body mass, and it might also promote fat mass reduction, which is pretty much what we've seen from the results of all the studies we've talked about up until this point. And then the second meta-analysis was done by Levy and coworkers, and they were looking at athletic performance as a whole, so not necessarily just resistance training. In this meta-analysis, they did mention 2 studies in which they saw a decrease in performance when it comes to sprinting athletes and cyclists, so both while implementing intermittent fasting. But they did note that after a couple days, they did see a small return in that performance, which seemed to suggest that over the long term, your body might actually adapt to intermittent fasting. But initially speaking, if you just switch to intermittent fasting, you might see a small decrease in performance. The studies that they looked at involving resistance training saw minimal negative effects of intermittent fasting on lean body mass, which is pretty consistent with everything that we've seen thus far. However, they do point out in this meta-analysis the Moro study that we talked about, in which they saw a reduction in testosterone, which remember is going to be a very important hormone when it comes to putting on muscle. All the studies that we've looked at today seem to suggest that intermittent fasting might be okay when it comes to maintaining muscle. However, there's no evidence to suggest that intermittent fasting is going to be superior in terms of putting muscle on your body. In fact, I actually think it's quite the opposite. So there are 2 articles that I'll show that actually suggest that having adequate amounts of protein throughout the day and spacing up your meals rather than intermittent fasting is going to be superior in terms of muscle protein synthesis. For that reason, coupled with the fact that we know intermittent fasting is going to reduce your appetite, as we saw in the first study, because you have a smaller eating window, as well as the decrease in testosterone, I just don't think intermittent fasting is going to be good if your overall goal is to build muscle. The only scenario in which I would suggest doing intermittent fasting is if you are doing a cut and you know that that is one way that you can adhere to a calorie deficit, because again, adherence to a diet is going to be most important for whatever goal it is you're after. But other than that, I don't really see any additional benefits to doing intermittent fasting, especially not during a bulk when the overall goal is to be building muscle. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments down below. And again, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe, turn those notification bells on, because I post new videos every single Friday and you do not want to miss when they go live. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.